What's going on, data devotees? It's Jameson here. This video is a very brief introduction to R Markdown. What is it? How do you create a document in R Markdown? And lastly, and most importantly, how are we going to be using R Markdown for the assignments and final projects in this course? And so without further ado, let's jump right in. So I'm currently in the home page for Foundations of Data Science Part 1, and it's very easy to essentially open up the R Markdown documents that you need. I'm going to click on Course Schedule, and we have all of the welcome and introductory materials that you have for pre-course preparation. But once we start getting into week 1, week 2, week 3, each of those will have a lab assignment. And if we click on, for example, lab 1, we have not only a link that takes us to the instructions for the lab, but we also have a link that takes us to the template for the lab as well. Now, if you click on that, it will automatically download the lab template, and you'll simply have to unzip it. And once you do, you'll be able to open it up in RStudio, and it's pretty much ripped and ready to go. You can immediately compile this as a functioning interactive document in R Markdown. And that's what R Markdown is. But before we do that, let's look at how to create one from scratch. And so if I click on File and select New File, I can choose R Markdown. All we have to do is supply a title and the author. Now I'm going to keep the author as RStudio because we're going to use their example. So when we start an R Markdown document from scratch, we're in effect opening up this R Markdown document that's already prepared for us as sort of an example of how you can use R Markdown. And this is a great demonstration of what R Markdown is and what it does. So underneath the hood, we have all of this different code, and what we see is human-readable code that is formatted with Markdown, regular Markdown, and we also have what are called code chunks, and this is where the actual R language is interpreted and produces some sort of a result, whether it's calling function summary on the dataset cars, or plotting a graphic on the pressure dataset. So again, what's happening here in the gray is R is compiling its kind of machine readable code and executing the commands that you put inside these code chunks, and outside in these white areas outside of the code chunk is where we can put our human readable language, and we use the markup language Markdown to be able to format it. If I click knit, we'll see that in fact we don't see this code whatsoever in this code chunk. In the other code chunks we will see the code, but let's see what this looks like. First you have to save it. And do recall always that you have to save it as a .rmd file. Now I think in newer editions of RStudio that's unnecessary to specify this what's called an extension, but it is always important to do that because you're essentially letting R know, don't interpret this as a regular script. This is an R Markdown document. I'll hit save, and it's compiling it right now for us. So this is the example R Markdown document that RStudio provides. Here again, we see the human readable language, and it has a bit of formatting done in Markdown as well. Not only the header, but we have boldface, and we have here a link, not a hyperlink, but an active link. And we can actually see the R code that's presented in the code chunks and the result of that R code. This is actually a practice known as literate programming, or literate statistical programming in this case. And what we're doing is essentially combining human readable language, that's the literate portion, and programming or machine readable language, and that is the programming portion. So again, literate programming, and this really allows us to be able to create a Markdown document that you can imagine is legible, readable, and understandable by lay audiences, for example, an executive or a team leader who may not be familiar with R, or any other stakeholder who may not be incredibly data literate or R literate. And you can combine this sort of language which explains your process with the processes itself, which is more useful for sharing with analysts and any other R users who might be interested more in your code rather than the summaries that you provide in human-readable language. So again, this really combines the best of both worlds in that we can communicate with broad audiences using human-readable language, and we can communicate the code and processes that we use in machine-readable language, which is of more interest to analysts and other R users. So that is the R Markdown document. Again, we knitted, or the default R Markdown document, I should say. We knitted it by clicking this knit button, and we can, in fact, go ahead and eliminate all of this, keeping only what's called the YAML header. And we can also make a bunch of customizations to the YAML header, which change the format, the style, whether we have a table of contents, what type of output it is, whether it's HTML or PDF. And we can actually create a brand new R Markdown document here. And we'll start off with a header. This is human-readable language. And then we'll even include a code chunk. So you start a code chunk with these backticks, and there's 3 of them specifically. Now the backtick is located on the same key as the tilde. In most keyboards, it's in the upper left corner, right underneath the escape button. And then we have R in curly brackets, and then that creates a code chunk. Another way to create a code chunk, instead of actually typing it out from scratch, is to click on Insert and R, and it will automatically create that code chunk for you. So again, we have this human-readable language, but now we can take, for example, the dataset empty cars, and we can run function head on it. And when I go to save and knit this, we're going to see that that code becomes evaluated. So the function head shows the first 6 observations in the data set that you input in the parentheses. And in this case, we have the first 6 vehicles in the empty cars data set. Again, a combination of human-readable language and a combination of machine-readable language. We format the human-readable language with Markdown, and we can do whatever we want in R with the machine-readable language. Now, chunks also have different options. And if, for example, what we saw here, the code was actually repeated, so we saw head empty cars, and then we saw the output of that code, which is the data set itself, we can disable that by disabling what's called echo. We simply set that to false. Now, these are called chunk options. So each of these is a code chunk, and you can add different options to your code chunks in order to be able to produce a different result. Now let's see what happens when we turn off echo. So now it's no longer repeating the call to head and empty cars. In other words, it's no longer repeating the machine-readable language. Instead, it's just giving us the output, which is quite nice. And there are other very common chunk options as well. So if you ever want to make some changes to your data, what's called pre-processing, you may also want to choose the option, and you'll see this in your homework. Instead of echo equals false, we'll do eval equals false. In other words, we're going to do include equals false. Now this is going to completely hide not only the code, the machine-readable code, but it's also going to hide the output of it as well. And there it is. So head empty cars, we don't see the 6 observations of the empty cars dataset at all. We don't see the code repeated at all, and that's because we have include equals false. Now, we can also do eval equals false, and this means that the code will be repeated, but it's not going to be evaluated. So now we don't see the output of the empty cars dataset. We just see a little bit of code that we wanted to share. So those are 3 different common chunk options that you might encounter when you're working with R Markdown. And again, we compile that, and certain things happen to the code chunks depending on those options. You compile it by clicking on knit, and you can knit to different options, but here we're simply knitting to HTML by default, as we define in this header. So The homework assignments themselves, and we're looking at Lab 1, are already ready to go. Now, I've included kind of an introduction here in a few different notes. When you see the hashtag or the pound sign, that's used for annotation in your code, and that allows, in this particular case, your instructor to be able to communicate specific things about your code. And we've got include equals false here, so we're setting up some options before we get into the nitty-gritty of actually creating this document. Now again, this document is ripped and ready to go. I simply click on knit, and it's going to take a little bit of time because it's actually loading in a very large data set with, if I recall correctly, over 40,000 different text parcels. And so this is what it looks like. So of course you would want to customize your name. You can keep pretty much everything else. We've got some introductory sections that discuss the data. And if we go further down, we can see the part where we actually want to modify. This is where you're going to want to use your code. We've got the questions themselves, and these all correspond to the questions that are in the lab assignment instructions. And lastly, we have some helpful hints and recommended functions. Do make sure that you delete all of the code at the bottom of this before you submit. And we have special submission instructions depending on if you're using Canvas or Blackboard or iCollege or anything like that, as well as some common issues you might experience when you're knitting, especially for your first time. So those are nice tips to pay attention to. Again, you want to eliminate everything below this line before that happens. And it's really just a matter of finding these questions and finding out, okay, this is where I write out my answer, and this is where I show the code to how I got that solution. Once you've done that, you simply click knit, and you're able to submit this assignment once it's completely filled out and modified with your name, the answers, and the solution code that you use to be able to get to those answers. And you simply save this as an HTML document. When you knit it, it will automatically be saved, and then you can submit that as your R Markdown document for the lab assignment, and that will be graded, etc., etc. Y'all know how it works. So that's a short introduction to R Markdown and how we're going to be using R Markdown in the course. I hope you found this video helpful, and I hope you have a lot. This is really one of the most incredible parts of R Markdown, of R in general, because we can create these interactive reports that can communicate to broad stakeholders from an executive level all the way to very advanced R users and collaborators at the data analytic level, and everybody in between. Really, that literate statistical programming is giving us the opportunity to combine the best parts of human-readable language and machine-readable language, and what's more, we can create dynamic reports that update as you introduce new data. This is one of the most powerful tools that we'll be using in the course, and you'll be using throughout your data analytic career with the R language. Thanks.